I've read some interesting things that you've written. In particular, following the pager and handheld radio operation that took place with Hezbollah not that long ago, and I wanted to get your take on it. I wanted to get your take on sort of the complexity of it all, the abilities of Mossad and Israeli intelligence in general, and also the utility of it. I mean, I almost got the sense, from one in particular, one thing that you had written that you thought, okay, well, maybe, why the timing now when there is, still intel to be collected? There's still value in not pushing the button and advising Hezbollah just how deep that penetration was. So I know that's a wide playing field. There's a lot of questions there. I'm just going to hand it over to you and say go.
Yeah, thanks for that. No, first off, it's an amazing success story in the ability of an intel service to identify the weaknesses in a supply chain, right? And Hezbollah has to get a lot of its technology, a lot of its material items outside the country, and it's sanctioned. It's a terrorist organization as well as a political party. So it has to do things in that gray market. So for the Israelis to have succeeded, they first have to identify how Hezbollah is operating their own supply chains, just in general. And they're going to do it through their diaspora. The Lebanese business community around the world is famous for being involved in all various sorts of import-export business. And of course, among those are going to be Hezbollah operatives. So that is a good place for any service to start. I know we've started there as well. And the Israelis had to narrow down who the main points were in that supply chain. But then they had to figure out what Hezbollah was looking for precisely. And then they had to find a means to introduce those items through a cover, right? Through having some, backstopped, and by backstop I mean some mechanism where some person playing a representative, representing a company, whatever, had something behind him, at least sufficient enough to withstand scrutiny. But Hezbollah, which has a great CI service, they really do, can only go so far because they can't talk to other governments, they can't go on Interpol, right? So they have to do their due diligence a little bit as well on the gray side. And that's where the Israeli success was key in doing that. And whether they actually fabricated these devices themselves, because they're all knockoffs, right, of these pagers and walkie-talkies, or bought legitimately made ones or legitimately knockoffs, if you would, and modify them, I don't think that's clear. My commentary, which, maybe now we have a little bit more 2020 hindsight, was that you go through all this work, you have that tremendous success of getting the supply chain. You've got basically walking, talking GPS locators. You can map out everyone in Hezbollah who has a pager, everywhere they go, and then what other pagers they're co-located with. You start creating who's who. You add the walkie-talkies, which is going to give you audio. You're going to capture those conversations. You could have probably even put more devices in the pagers to make them into cell phones, if you would, and they could be transmitting. So my thought was that if they went through all this as a premeditated way just to blow them up, unless they were going to immediately follow with an offensive, may not have been as worthwhile. And I think we would have held on and, until grim death until every last one was found, because every device is still working and giving you intel. I think the Israelis planned it in steps, as I think we've seen it unfold, that it was all interconnected. This wasn't haphazard. They planned the devices to explode. They wanted to throw the operation into chaos. They had a lot of tracking data to go on. They had already patterns of life of the people they were going to hit thereafter. They already had their military offensive up north to follow through on. So I think now, as we kind of see it weeks later, okay, I still might have advocated doing it a little bit different because I like intel, but at least it makes a bit more sense on how they approached it that way.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's still a lot of speculation over to why the timing, but I agree with you. I mean, it's like having a well-placed source, right? It's a sort of the difference between the intel operations and a law enforcement operation where law enforcement operations, sometimes your sources are one and done. You don't mind burning them. It's a very specific one-off task. But in the intel world, you tend to look at, hopefully, we're looking at the long-term value of any asset or any source or any operation. So it is fascinating. This is one of those questions I think that people probably hate. That's why I'm going to throw it out at you. Let's give it past the election. Let's give it past the inauguration. Let's go say 6 months from now. Do we have a ceasefire in Gaza? And to what degree does that influence then what happens up north with Hezbollah? I guess this kind of ties into the earlier question about your optimism and how you view the region. But if you were a betting man and you had to put money on this, do you think we get a ceasefire in the near future?
Yeah, I'm not really optimistic. I think some of the statements coming out of the White House, Jake Sullivan, there's sort of this renewed optimism suggesting, well, now that Sinwar is dead, Netanyahu can claim victory. We can get our ceasefire. But I think we've crossed the Rubicon here, where Netanyahu doesn't really see any constructive road to a ceasefire. Why does he need it? I think, having lived and known this area for a long, long time, I think they need another way out. I don't think they're going to destroy their threats. They're going to find themselves in a constant state of war for a very long time because they've eliminated any compromises, any sort of peaceful brokering of coexistence. But Netanyahu feels, and he's correct, he has the upper hand right now to continue striking militarily, to continue degrading, and he will. He's degrading Hezbollah, he's degrading Hamas, he's not destroying them. And we still haven't seen the other shoe fall when it comes to the Iran-Israel dynamic. Israel still plans retaliation. They've said, we've seen in the press, that they're not going to target the nuclear facilities, they're not going to target the energy facilities, as the United States has asked them not to. But where does that take us on the escalation ladder? If they strike, will Iran feel compelled to then escalate themselves and strike back? So I think, again, as I said earlier, a few weeks earlier, maybe a month or two, yeah, I think we'd be looking at a much better set of conditions for a ceasefire that would work for everybody. Hezbollah's already said, we won't stop shooting rockets until there's a ceasefire in Gaza. So they're kind of committed to that stance, right? Hamas has said, we're not going to accept a ceasefire until Israel agrees to withdraw militarily. Netanyahu doesn't feel he has to, even though his own military is kind of saying, yeah, but what's our tomorrow solution? Are we going to be here forever? So I think there's less political pressure, though, on Netanyahu now as there were a few weeks ago. There's no protests anymore. They've all gone. I mean, how are they going to protest the man who's killing all their enemies, even though it might be setting them up for sort of these longer-term consequences that are going to keep them fighting? People on both sides of the border, from what we see from some of the press coverage, saying, we just want a sense of normalcy back. And that's coming from Israelis and Lebanese alike, and the Palestinians are who in Gaza. But the people who are making the decisions are generally being served well, at least Israel and Netanyahu, and whoever is leading the military fight in Gaza is being served by these circumstances. So in that regard, I'm not terribly optimistic. I don't rule it out. There's going to be a new president one way or another. That's going to impact the dynamics among all the players here, all the stakeholders. And, for better or worse, it might give some of the players more reason to take a compromise while they can, before they think, okay, this could maybe get worse if we don't take a deal while we can take one.